Hello, BookTube. This is Mike Frost, the postmodern poetry prognosticator, here with my first Friday reads of the August in Africa Read-A-Thon, if I can get all that out. So I want to go through some of the stuff that I've read this week and a little bit of what the reading is for the following week. So I started with, as many of you remember, the New Generation's African Poets box set. This is the actual box set. And I did a couple of these already in videos. So this is the cover of the box set, the introduction to the box set. Outstanding stuff, well written, well designed. The first book, chapbook that I pulled out was Acts of Crucifixion. I did a video on this one, so it's really good. Armeika, I did another video on this one, so I won't talk too much about it, but this was outstanding. I love this one. And then on Monday, I kind of ran into a snag with the art poems. I read it in Monday morning. I was going to do a video on Monday morning with it, and I read it, and I'll be honest, I just didn't get it. I wasn't enamored with it, which is fine. I mean, not every set of poems is going to be for everybody, so I realize that. I read the poems. I went through the introduction to try to help. The introduction did not help me with these poems at all. It's one of those introductions that doesn't really say anything. A lot of words that don't say anything. Just a sentence out of it, just to get it understood. What becomes clear upon reading Amanda Bintu Holliday's The Art Poems is that the sound of the poems is only one of the ways that it generates meaning. I don't know of anybody that thought of that the only way to generate meaning was the sound of the poems. There's a lot of that stuff in there. The way I get a sense, and I'm curious if anybody else has got this box set, if they've read this, if they got it. I didn't get it. So I get the sense in reading the introduction and reading the poems that these were essentially ekphrasis poems. They were written on or about arts, and maybe that's why it's called the art poems. They were written on art pieces. And maybe if those were included in here, I might have been able to get it. Think of Instagram poetry. There's a lot of Instagram poetry that has a picture and the poem is placed on the picture. The picture is meant to reflect. Sometimes it's just cheap photo art from they can get off the internet, but sometimes it actually adds to the meaning of the poem. And in a lot of ekphrasis poems about works of art, if you know the work of art, the poem becomes more meaningful. And maybe that's what I'm missing here. I don't know. I didn't. I tried it, reading it again Monday evening to see if I could get something so I could throw out a video on it. Still didn't get it, so I put it down. Not every poem set is for everybody, so I'm not trying to make a judgment on this thing. It just wasn't for me. I didn't get it, so I moved on to my Tuesday reading, which was much better. A Brief Biography of My Name by Yalie Kamara, I believe is the way you pronounce the name. Let me see if I can get it in there. You can make your own judgments. This one, when it was the poems that were about the name, like the first poem in here, I just moved my marker, was about her name and the basically the meaning of all the parts of her name, the title poem, A Brief Biography, and you can see where the parts of the names and then basically breaks down what the meanings were. I thought it was excellent. This is a Friday read, so I'm not going to try to go through every poem in here, but it was delicious. When she stuck with that, it was great. When it got more into the personal, some of them I got, some of them I didn't. But one thing that I did want to mention, there's just a stanza in this poem here that I found delicious. I've mentioned before, it's the little things in poetry that just amuse me and draw my attention, that I really have fun with. And Terrible is the name of the poem, and it's an okay poem. Not a great poem, but an okay poem. But the first stanza, it's a 2-line stanza, I just found delicious. So I'm going to read it to you. I know that homesickness is born of distance, and that distance cures homesickness. Which is another way to say the absence makes the heart grow fonder, is the first line. So I know that homesickness is born of distance. The further away, you get homesick when you're away from home. But the second line, all right, and that distance, Caesura, cures homesickness. So sometimes, and you get the meaning based on look at the two lines. So the first line, the distance creates homesickness. And the second line, the distance can cure it. Notice the second line is shorter than the first line. So sometimes distance from home can make you homesick, but sometimes being closer to home can cure that homesickness in ways that the rest of the poem make more humorous. But I just thought that the first line draws out. I know that homesickness is born of distance, and that distance cuts the line, cures homesickness. So you get two short things that make the reader or the listener understand that the distance she's referring to in the second line is the shorter distance. Little things like that just amuse me with poetry, that the poet can have that kind of control of the language. And even when the poems were not really for me in this small chapbook, the poet having control of the language still drew my attention, still made me enjoy this book more than the art poems, which I just didn't get. Clay Plates by Alexis, I'm going to try that, Teyie, was another very good collection. I tabbed a bunch of these things that I wanted to go back to, that I went through. So it starts with personal poetry, and then the poetry gets progressively more, I'll use the term political, but not in a Republican Democrat kind of political way, but more worldly kind of political. But one of the poems that really I enjoyed was There Goes. One of the early poems is more of a personal poem, not outside, but more political poem, a personal poem rather. The night I leave you, the sky breaks out in stars. They burn like open sores. The acacia, scarred from private wars, still has leaves. I am not radical in my sorrow. What has come before, that which has been handed down, these are my only methods. I feel what I feel should be felt. I say nothing new, nothing different. My concerns are as they have been before. Is the tea too cold to drink? And when I was reading the poem, I immediately remembered a Poem for Every Agony tag that we did on PoetryTube. And it's one of those for heartaches. I think this poem will stick with me for one of those poems about heartache. It's just a simple poem, but wonderfully rendered. So many poems in here I've tagged for further review. About midway through the poems, they start to turn political. Not to say not politician type political, but I hope you understand my meaning when I say political there. It goes from I hope that we don't run out of English to non-compliance, which reminded me of a Billy Collins poem. She switches from talking a lot about her father to talking about her mother. One of the fluid mechanics, one of the last ones, is the stanzas are more prose poetry than verse. But I like this last stanza in prose poetry. I, for one, have been researching poems to invoke dramatically upon the moment of my death. Also, I have been walking around with music playing through my earphones, even when I'm not wearing them, so my death has a soundtrack like any proper movie. Rejecting the popular, do not go gentle into that good night, I have settled on Stevie Smith's not waving, but drowning. Just the idea invoked with that stanza was lovely. I just had a lovely one. And if you've never read Stevie Smith's Not Waving But Drowning, go look up that poem. Outstanding poem, great poem. Not that Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is not a fantastic, classic poem. But that she would switch to Not Waving But Drowning adds to the humor of the stanza if you're familiar with that poem. So a wonderful collection, Clay Plates. I do look forward to Alexis Teyie. I'm guessing on these names here. I hope that I see more from her in the future. I will be looking for that. There's some really outstanding poetry. Daughter Tongue is another, I'm going to try this, Omotara James is another collection that it's more collections of, if I can put it this way, a daughter writing poems to, for, about the relationship with her mother. So obviously I'm not a target audience in this thing, but they're lovely poems. And I really enjoyed stepping into that world and just listening to that, if I can put it this way, conversation she was having through the poems with, and I never assumed that the poet is the same as the narrator. So here I would say that daughters, generic, talking to mothers, generic, is more the idea that gets across with this thing, although she's specifics in this thing. And they're lovely poems. I'm not the target audience, but lovely poems. I immensely enjoyed spending a little time in this book, this chapbook. So I would recommend that. That would be a good recommendation for that. So the chapbooks I read every morning, one every morning, and kind of just experienced them. And then I went on and I switched up the readings between, I always, as I've told the folks on this channel before, I always have a novel, a book of poetry, and a nonfiction book going at the same time. So I selected one of each for my readings of this week. The poetry book that I selected, besides chapbooks, was Okot Bitak's Song of Lawino, Song of Ocol. And I've got to take the time to do a individual video about this book. This, hands down, is the best poetry book I've read this year and is up in the top favorites of poetry books. I don't give stars to these kind of things, but this is a 5-star read. This was fantastic from start to finish. I'm going to do an individual video. I got to do an individual video on this one. So if you see it pop up, this was outstanding. I zipped through this and then went back through it. I've got so many notes on this thing. Outstanding read. Please, if you see this one of my videos, please click on it. I would love to have a chat with you about that book. It was fantastic. The novel that I read, let me get it up here, was The Gold Diggers. I got it online, so I read it on my tablet by Sue Nyathi. This was recommended to me from another booktuber, Marina, over at Young, Gifted, and Black. I'll link her review of this book below. She's far better at doing novel reviews than I am. And I second everything she says about this book in her video. She does an outstanding review of it. It's spot on. It's beautifully done. So I'll just add a few of my own comments to her outstanding review of this book, and with one disagreement with her on the title. In the foreword to the book, the author gives a reasoning behind her choice of the title. I understand the reasoning. I just disagree with it. I think she did a disservice, and I think the publishers did a disservice by going with that title. It has a different connotation in the West, and especially in the United States, and I don't know how widespread that connotation is, of the idea of a woman that's trying to get with a sugar daddy, trying to ease her way into money, digging for gold through other people. This book has nothing to do with that. As Marina says in Young, Gifted, Black, I'll link it below, it's about the 7 people leaving Zimbabwe to go to Johannesburg. And it also covers the driver, the co-driver, and a girlfriend that are all part of this long story. Now, I am a plot-driven kind of reader. This is a character-driven kind of book, and maybe why I shy away from character-driven books is that I'm a very shallow person. Don't get emotionally attached to characters. And when you give me a character-driven book, especially one with well-drawn-out, beautifully drawn-out characters, like Suit is in this book, I can't help but get emotionally attached to him, which is the downfall of anybody that's going to read a character-driven book, because they. I won't add too much more to the review than Marina does, but these characters, they go from Zimbabwe to Johannesburg. You follow them through the ups and downs of their lives. It got to the point where whenever something good happened to somebody, I was like, oh, please don't let something good happen. It's a weird thing, but because as soon as something good happened, it would just collapse. And this is the story of immigrants, in this case, Zimbabwe to Johannesburg, South Africa, but you can substitute immigrants trying to get into Europe. You can substitute the idea of these in the current news today, immigrants coming from Central and South America trying to get to the United States. These stories are heart-wrenching. They're real. They are true to life examples of what happens when people are forced to leave for their own safety, for their own good, the countries of their origins, to try to get to a safe zone. The experience that they go through with xenophobia, with this book covers so much and so well. I would do a disservice not to just ask you to see Marina's review at Young, Gifted, and Black. I'll link it below. It is a quick read. You go through this thing because you're driven by the characters. And it is well plotted. It's well plotted, well structured, and it drags you. I mean, just rips you through this entire book. It's fantastically written. I don't know that I could add anything else to that idea except get this book. I disagree with the title. I wish they had titled it. I think the reason it's not more well known and more widely read on BookTube and elsewhere is the unfortunate title. And I understand, I read the introduction, I understand why she chose the title, and Johannesburg is the city of gold. I get that. Just a different title, I think, would have avoided a misunderstanding. And people, unfortunately, when they're picking up books, judge them by their covers, judge them by their titles. And a different title, I think, would have given a wider audience to this book. But if Marina can do anything to change your mind, please review her stuff. The nonfiction book that I started, I didn't finish this book. I read the first 4 sections of Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. I'm familiar with the Nelson Mandela story. Lived in the age of apartheid, but this was really opening my eyes on a lot of different things. Not all of it that I agreed with Mr. Mandela, but this is a fascinating story. Of course, tabbing way too much to read to you, but some early on kind of things that I noted in here. Some early on notes was there was some storytellers that affected him early in his life, and one of them was a poet storyteller that came into one of his campuses when he was in school, and it really had an effect on him. And of course, as someone that reads a lot of poetry and as a poetry lover, to hear that from someone like Nelson Mandela, to say that his early development, his early character development was affected by a poet storyteller that comes in. We didn't agree with everything he said, but it just affected the way he saw the world. That is the power of poetry. That is really the power of storytelling. These novels, whether it be done through novels, poetry, or even a well-written nonfiction book that reads like a story. The power of storytelling to change the thinking of an individual, whether they be young or old, is really the power of what storytelling is. There was, in his early development, he talks about what schools he went through, his first marriage, the first children that were born of death of his first daughter. A couple of things that were mentioned in here, how the Mahatma Gandhi campaigns in the early 1900s there in South Africa had a lasting effect on the way things were conducted during his early campaigns, and not always to the better. Some of the things that I was really I knew already, but was disappointed even in reading it again, was how divided the resistance to apartheid was over colored lines. There was, even in Nelson Mandela, I hate calling him Nelson, I want to call him Rololala, but even he didn't want to do any campaigns that weren't initiated by the ANC, the blacks that he was, the groups that he was a part of. He didn't want to participate in any campaigns that were initiated by the Indians of South Africa, or what they call the coloreds, which is the mixed race groups, or even the communists, which were, if I can characterize this as a mischaracterization, but a lot of whites that were sympathetic to the issues. He didn't want to participate in it. And some of his views about nonviolence, I just couldn't disagree with him more. Let me see if I can find one of those tabs in here. He later on, so it talks about in one of the chapters, it talks about the beginnings of apartheid and how they had a relatively more liberal government in play, and these Nazi sympathizer party, the Nationalist Party, was running for government, and nobody thought that they could win. Just nobody. They didn't even worry about that. They just figured they were, because they were Nazi sympathizers, and this was like right after World War II, that nobody thought they were getting power. So they didn't even concern themselves with the election. Of course, the major characters along Nelson Mandela's area couldn't vote anyway, but they weren't really worried about it. They were concentrating on the existing government and how they could resist the existing government, when all of a sudden the Nationalist Party, the National Party, which is like almost, well, they're the beginnings of apartheid, so they are a neo-Nazi kind of party, suddenly swept into power. And it surprised everybody. And of course, they immediately start creating apartheid. And one person, Oliver, one of Nelson Mandela's friends, he writes in this book, he says, Oliver took a more considered line when talking about the disaster that was the beginning of the nationalist regime, then apartheid. He says, I like this, he said. I like this. I could not imagine why, he explained. Now we will know exactly who our enemies are and where they stand. And he goes on to explain something like that. And I could not help. I have a lot of friends in a lot of different communities, and one of the things they say is a positive behind Trump being in office, which I find very little positive there, is that all the white supremacists have now come out of the closet. They're open about their hatred for other races and religions and everything. They've come out of it, and they say that's the one good thing that's come out of this. No, that's not a good thing that's come out of this. That this would be propagated and put out there. But I couldn't help but think of all the comments that I've heard about when Trump came into power. They said, "Oh, the one good thing is that it's going to bring them all out where we'll know where they are." Yeah, I don't find very much positive there. So another segment I marked out here is, this is from Nelson Mandela's point of view. He talks about a campaign that they had. There was some outbreaks of violence, and in this particular campaign, it was probably instigated by the government infiltrating into the protesters and creating violence themselves. So it wasn't created by the protesters; they were pretty much nonviolent. But that's a supposition. In this, the government was successful, for the riots poisoned the view of some of the whites who might otherwise have been sympathetic. And I think that's a huge thing when he starts criticizing this, he calls it a strategy rather than a lifestyle of nonviolence. the strategy of nonviolence, which I think does a disservice to what nonviolent protests are. If you study Gandhi, you'll know what I'm talking about here. There's a difference between it being who you are and a strategy toward getting something. A strategy, as a strategy, it does not work because you always leave it if it's a tactic or a strategy, if it's not a lifestyle, if it's not a commitment. But it's recognized there that in order for any of these nonviolent protests to work, or any social change through nonviolence, and I'll just put a little caveat, the only way to change social structures and keep your soul, which is one of the major goals of nonviolent satyagraha type nonviolence from Gandhians, is when it creates social change without destroying who you are. Violence might create social change, but it also changes who you are. And the second part of it is the violent, in order to be successful, the idea is to convert those that would be your opposition to see you as human. Because most of these, in the case of white supremacists, now there are white supremacists that will always be white supremacists. You can't change their mind. But there's a lot of people that have leanings or are inundated by this information from their families and social surroundings that might otherwise think, wait a minute, through nonviolence you can make the people that aren't fully indoctrinated question that indoctrination. And that is one of the major goals of using nonviolence as a life force. So in order to be successful, in a lot of cases, you have to have support from the general population of your opposition, your normal opposition. And that's the same in South Africa as it was for the civil rights movement here in the United States, as it is the Palestinian struggle, the first Intifada. All of these things are connected with getting the sympathy, if you will, or empathy of a general population, either in that society or in the world. So even here he recognizes it, and yet later on he does a speech in which he says, in his own way, in those he was known as a rabble rouser. And at one point he says, as I was condemning the government in a big speech, as I was condemning the government for its ruthlessness and lawlessness, I stepped across the line. I said that at the time for passive resistance had ended, that nonviolence was a useless strategy and could never overthrow the white minority regime bent on retaining its power at any cost. At the end of the day, I said violence was the only weapon that would destroy apartheid, and we must be prepared in the near future to use that weapon. I could not disagree with him more. And that's a longer debate for another day, but that speech basically transformed it. He later, again, in his words, so you can argue with me in this, but in his words, in India, Gandhi had been dealing with a foreign power that ultimately was more realistic and far-sighted. That was not the case with the Afrikaans in South Africa. Nonviolent passive resistance is effective as long as your opposition adheres to the same rules you do, which couldn't be any further from the truth. But I'll go on with what he says. But if peaceful protest is met with violence, its efficiency is at an end. It's actually where it's most effective. Note the Gandhi resistance, the Salt March, other things. Anyway, study, I'll go on. For me, nonviolence was not a moral principle, but a strategy. There was no moral goodness in using an ineffective weapon. But my thoughts on this matter were not yet formed, and I had spoken too soon. So I'm curious as to when that idea changed. I'm sure Desmond Tutu had a lot to do with that, but I wait to see. I got the first 4 sections of this. I divided this book into 3 because next week I'm reading a different nonfiction book, and then I'll go back and go to the second third, and then the last week I'll do the third. So that was the books that I've read this first week. I am switching over to Chinua Achebe, I've got for next week's readings, I've got Home in Exile, his essays. I will do his first novel, actually a reread for me, Things Fall Apart, and his collected poems. That's not much of a week's readings there, but I will go through those. I actually, when I was in this bookstore, I found another anthology of books that I'll probably add to my reading list here, The Return of the Amasi Bird, Black South African Poetry from 1891 to 1981. Nice little bookmark of lines of poetry. So for not being too familiar with the Black South African poetry of that era, I look forward to adding that to my reading list, along with the remaining chapbooks in this chapbook set. I have several that I will be adding. Those will be my morning reads, and then I'll get the other readings, still doing Doom Tube, Doom Messiah, which is only done on Sundays. But that's my Friday reads, the first Friday reads for the August in Africa Read-A-Thon. I'm really looking forward to anybody's reading recommendations. I am taking them back. Well, I'll talk more about them later, but I am paying attention. I am listening, and I am adding things to my TBR based on your recommendations. I urge you to go over to Rashmika at Rashmika Likes Books, my co-host for this read-a-thon. Her videos are fantastic as always. So until next Friday, or if I do some videos off these chapbooks, it'll be sometime this week. But if not, I will see you on the next Friday reads, and I'll let you know what I thought of those 4 books that I've added to my TBR for next week. All right, BookTube, thank you very much for joining me on this read-along. Thank you.